The Wall Street Journal editorial board started its Sunday editorial, The Triumph of Clarence Thomas, with a milestone. Congratulations to Clarence Thomas, who this week will become the second longest serving Supreme Court justice in history. This wasn't what most legal experts expected when President George H.W. Bush elevated Judge Thomas from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals at age 43 in 1991. Clarence Thomas voted with the Republican majority on the Supreme Court last week, in effect repealing part of the Voting Rights Act. As Justice Elena Kagan wrote in her dissent, this decision renders Section 2 all but a dead letter. In the states where that law continues to matter, the states still marked by residential segregation and racially polarized voting, minority voters can now be cracked out of the electoral process. The latest chapter in the majority's now completed demolition of the Voting Rights Act. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw is not surprised. She worked to defeat Clarence Thomas' nomination to the Supreme Court as a member of Anita Hill's legal team in 1991. In her wonderful new book, Backtalker, an American memoir, Professor Crenshaw writes, the hopes that several black leaders placed in Clarence Thomas's upbringing as black and poor did little to stop him from repeatedly ruling against black and poor people. His Deep South roots, where for decades African-American voters had been disenfranchised and worse, did nothing to discourage Thomas from helping to gut the Voting Rights Act, widely regarded as the crown jewel of the civil rights era. His vote in Citizens United helped put our republic on a fire sale, eventually making it possible for an autocrat to rule over the most powerful democracy in the world. And Professor Crenshaw writes this about what she expected on the day Clarence Thomas was confirmed in 1991. When at last Thomas was confirmed, I whispered, this is going to change the rest of our lives. Joining us now is Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She's Distinguished Professor of Law and the Promise Institute Chair in Human Rights at UCLA and Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. She is the co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum. Her new book is Backtalker, an American memoir, and it is available everywhere at midnight tonight and going forward. Kimberly, so glad you're back. So glad you're here with this book. This is just a remarkable story. I've always known you're remarkable. Now I know so much more. We're focusing on Clarence Thomas because of the Voting Rights Act last week, but there's so much more in this book, and I hope we get to so much more in this book. But that quote, that line of yours, on the day that he was confirmed, there was still hope. I was working
You
in the
might have been hopeful.
No, I wasn't by that time. But working in the Senate, I know there was still hope.
Yeah.
That maybe when this guy gets on the court, maybe he won't be like one of those reactionary Republicans. Turns out he's the leader of the pack.
Well, absolutely one of the most powerful Supreme Court justices ever. And, you know, folks were not alone in being hopeful. A lot of very famous and respected people believed that if we just leave the lights on, Clarence Thomas will come home. Maya Angelou wrote an op-ed in the New York Times around that time saying, you know, because he was black and because he grew up poor in the South, there's something deep inside him that he will rediscover. The SCLC, which was Martin Luther King's organization, they supported Clarence Thomas. He had support from across the black political spectrum and also within some of the traditional civil rights groups because they thought that there was something deeply embedded in him. I was not optimistic at all. I remembered what he had done at the EEOC. I remembered how he had slowed enforcement. I remembered how he talked about civil rights leaders. I remembered how he talked about his own sister. I saw this person as a dyed-in-the-wool, deeply conservative individual who was not going to somehow rediscover some deep connection to communities of
color. And most importantly, about everything you just described,
yes,
all policy you were opposed to his nomination before Anita Hill revelations.
That's
everything
right.
you just cited was before the Anita Hill revelations.
All that was true. All that was already well known. But, you know, the line that I say in the book, that our lives are going to be changed forever, was followed by a line by the person who ended up co-founding the African American Policy Forum with me. And what he said is, all because we refused to believe a Black woman. So what we got from Clarence Thomas, from the failure to credit what Anita Hill had to say, is the end of meaningful campaign finance reform. What we got was the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. What we got was undermining other kind of protections that people bled for, some people died for. He was that fifth vote that undermined the structure of civil rights enforcement. So it's a story about the failure to understand Black women's experiences, and I call it a huge intersectional failure. You had anti-racist groups really responding to this high-tech lynching idea, and Anita Hill didn't have anything that she could have said that would have rallied the forces in the same way.
So this is a memoir about much more than just that crusade and many other crusades. What you know, one of the things that interests me right now as a subject with people who are talking about how difficult it is coming out of college now, starting off in the world now. What made you start in the direction you started, and how did you get your start?
Oh, well, my story is one in which my family, my mother, my father, they were called race men of the 20th century. They were people who fought against the barriers, the obstacles, but also thought it was important to make sure that we were prepared to walk through those doors when they finally opened. I was that generation that was not born into a state of freedom. I was born before the Voting Rights Act, before the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 65. So that was just an imagination, a possibility that they were preparing us for. But one of the ways that my family did prepare me for that was to make sure that I had something to say, that I wasn't just living life, I just wasn't letting it pass me by, that I observed what my life was, that I had something to say about it. And I actually had to come to the dinner table every night with something to offer to the conversation. So I was always the person who was observing, I was asking questions. If it didn't make sense to me, I would keep asking questions. And that's more or less what led me to some of the observations about how race was functioning in my life, and then how gender was also functioning to shape and delimit some of the possibilities.